Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the most complex research and deliver the crucial insights you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we are tackling, well, what might be the ultimate paradox of human life: near-death experiences, or NDEs.
It's a fascinating subject. It's really the frontier where biology seems to end and consciousness somehow seemingly continues.
Mhm.
We're going to be synthesizing evidence from, decades of systematic research, drawing on cutting-edge neuroscience, some incredible in-hospital studies like the AWARE project, and of course the huge philosophical questions this all raises.
Right. And our mission today, for you, is to really break down the two major frameworks trying to make sense of these experiences, these profoundly vivid, often mystical conscious episodes that happen right when life is ending, and the brain should, by all traditional measures, just be collapsing.
Exactly. So on one hand, you have the neurophysiological model, and we'll be looking at a very new comprehensive framework called Neptune.
And on the other.
On the other, you have the robust evidence that points toward a non-local consciousness. And we're going to put them into dialogue, really see where they clash, and maybe more importantly, where they might actually converge.
Okay, so before we dive in, let's establish our terms. What exactly are we talking about when we say NDE?
It's a great question because we need to be clear. These aren't just, hallucinations or some drug-induced flight of fancy. Researchers define them very specifically as episodes of disconnected consciousness.
Disconnected consciousness.
Right. They are subjectively real, incredibly rich experiences. They're characterized by a set of, prototypical mystical features, and they typically happen during moments of actual or perceived physical threat. Think cardiac arrest, severe trauma, that sort of thing.
And crucially, we aren't just relying on subjective storytelling here, are we? The field has moved way beyond just collecting anecdotes. There's a standardized quantitative measure for this.
Absolutely. That was a huge step for the field. To classify an experience as a core NDE, researchers now use something called the Near-Death Experience Content Scale, or the NDEC scale.
Okay, so how does that work?
It's a scale with 20 distinct items. It covers everything from feelings of peace to a life review to meeting other entities. And to qualify, a patient has to hit a minimum cutoff score of 27 out of a possible 80.
So there's a clinical threshold.
Exactly. This standardization is critical. It lets us rigorously compare experiences across different cultures, different medical situations, and see the patterns.
What's so compelling and what I think immediately sets NDEs apart from, say, the confused memories of a patient who is just unconscious is the sheer quality of the memory itself.
That is the central contradiction, isn't it? Studies that compare NDE memories to memories from patients who were in a coma or had intensive care delirium but no NDE show this striking qualitative difference.
How so?
The NDE memories are just superior. They are clearer, significantly more vivid, and just so much richer in both emotional content and visual detail. People often say the experience felt more real than ordinary waking life.
More real than real. And that's the puzzle. How this rich memory gets formed when the brain is supposedly compromised, starved of oxygen. That's the core question we need to address today.
That's the one.
Okay, let's start by mapping out the experience itself. What are the common features that reliably show up time and time again?
We can group them pretty neatly. First, you have what we call the perception-related features. These are the sensory component.
So what you see, what you hear.
Exactly. Survivors often report hearing voices, or sometimes a buzzing sound. They experience these unusual physical sensations, and very often there's this immediate radical shift in their emotional state. A feeling of profound peace, the sense of well-being is a very common starting point.
But sometimes fear too, right?
Oh, yes. Sometimes overwhelming fear, especially in the initial moments. It's not always a blissful experience from the get-go.
And then the second category seems to be less about sensation and more about interpretation, a deeper, almost philosophical understanding of what's happening.
That's a perfect way to put it. We call those the interpretive features. These often involve the person realizing they are coming close to some kind of symbolic border or a point of no return.
And they feel like they have a choice.
Often, yes. A conscious decision about whether to continue on or to turn back. And you also get these fascinating reports of precognition or flash forwards. The experiencer might get a glimpse of future scenes, maybe from their personal life or sometimes even broader, more global events.
Which suggests that in that state, our normal understanding of time and space just doesn't apply.
It really seems to be non-local, or at least non-linear.
And beyond those two sort of clinical categories, our popular understanding is really dominated by the classic features, the ones that Raymond Moody first wrote about decades ago. They're almost cliches now, but they are still reported with incredible consistency.
They're absolute constants in the data. That profound sense of peacefulness and well-being, that's almost universal. Then you have the very distinct vision of the tunnel, which leads toward this intensely bright, loving light.
The out-of-body experience.
The classic out-of-body experience, or OBE, yes. And maybe the most emotionally powerful feature for many, the encounters where they meet other beings. Spiritual guides, or very often deceased relatives who seem to be there to greet them. These features pop up across every culture, every demographic.
And that brings us right to the foundational paradox, the tension that fuels this entire deep dive. How can this exquisitely rich, structured, coherent conscious experience happen during an acute physiological crisis, especially one as severe as, say, cardiac arrest?
The paradox is so acute because it fundamentally challenges the standard scientific model. I mean, the reductionist position that consciousness is exclusively a product of brain function.
It's a direct challenge.
It is. We're talking about sophisticated cognitive activity, memory formation, emotion, self-awareness happening during a state where there should be minimal or even zero brain activity.
Let's be very clear about what we mean by clinical death in these studies.
Right. It's a very precise term here. It's the period of unconsciousness that's caused by a total lack of oxygen to the brain. That's anoxia, which happens when circulation and breathing stop.
Like in a cardiac arrest.
The most common cause, yes.
Yeah.
And the biological clock starts ticking the moment that blood flow stops. Critically, without immediate resuscitation, irreversible brain cell damage usually kicks in within about 5 to 10 minutes. That leads to biological death.
And yet, that 5 to 10 minute window.
That is precisely the window where many of these structured, lucid, conscious experiences are reported to happen.
It's just incredible to think that structured thought could be happening when all the biological systems are failing so catastrophically. This entire field really owes its existence to a few pioneers who took it from folklore and turned it into a systematic inquiry.
Two figures really stand out. The first, of course, is Raymond Moody. He's the one who coined the term near-death experience in his landmark 1975 book, Life After Life. He was the first to really collect these accounts, I think over 150 of them, and establish the common patterns. He gave the phenomenon a name, and with that, a certain legitimacy.
But the really systematic, large-scale medical research that came later, and it was led by a cardiologist, which I think lends a lot of clinical weight to the findings.
That's where Pim van Lommel comes in. He was, by his own admission, a staunch reductionist. He believed everything had a simple materialist explanation.
Which what changed his mind.
His skepticism was completely shattered in 1986. He read a book called Return from Tomorrow by a physician named George Ritchie, who recounted this incredibly intense NDE he had all the way back in 1943.
And Ritchie's case is fascinating because of the clinical time frame, right?
It's jaw-dropping. Ritchie was clinically dead for about 9 minutes from double pneumonia. His body was pronounced dead. It was covered with a sheet.
9 minutes. That's well into the irreversible damage window.
It is. It took this one persistent male nurse who convinced a very skeptical doctor to try an adrenaline injection directly into Ritchie's heart, a procedure that was highly experimental at the time. And it worked. It restored his circulation. Van Lommel just couldn't reconcile the clinical fact of 9 minutes of death with Ritchie's incredibly detailed, coherent memories of being conscious during that time.
The cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. It prompted him to start systematically and prospectively asking every single patient he resuscitated about what they remembered. And that led to his foundational Dutch studies. This move from accidental anecdotes to standardized prospective medical inquiry, that was the pivotal moment for the field.
So we have the paradox established. Now let's explore the most sophisticated modern attempt to provide a purely materialist explanation for all this. In the past, the theories were a bit fragmented, but now we have this comprehensive Neptune model.
Right. The Neptune model, which was just published by Marshall and his colleagues in 2025, is a major step forward. It really tries to integrate all these disparate findings, psychological expectations, evolutionary pressures, the whole neurophysiological chaos into a single, unified framework.
And the model is, from what I understand, most successful at explaining the perception-related fears of the NDE. It can account for the sensations, the mood shifts, the visual elements, through the chemistry of the dying brain.
Precisely. Neptune's strength is detailing the acute, cascading changes in the neurotransmitter systems that are triggered by the crisis. The lack of oxygen, the extreme stress, the sudden shock. It all sets off a chain reaction. It focuses heavily on the interplay between the serotonergic, glutamatergic, and GABAergic systems.
Okay, let's start with serotonin, or 5-HT. This seems to be the main engine, maybe the chemical key that unlocks the mystical parts of the experience. Why does this system react so violently to a life-threatening crisis?
Serotonin is a monoamine neurotransmitter, and it's highly preserved across evolution, which tells us it plays a deep, fundamental role in our survival mechanisms. The empirical evidence here is just striking. There are studies where rats underwent asphyxia to simulate cardiac arrest, and they show this dramatic, acute surge in brain serotonin levels.
And we're not talking about a small change.
Not at all. We're talking about serotonin concentrations reaching 100 to 200 times higher than the baseline level, right in the initial moments of the crisis.
100 to 200 times. That's an astronomical increase. It's literally a chemical bomb going off in the brain. So how does that massive surge produce both that feeling of ultimate peace and the visual stuff, like the tunnel?
It's a neat trick of receptor specialization. Serotonin acts on many different types of receptors, but two are really dominant in the NDE context, and they often have opposing effects.
Okay, break that down for us.
So first you have the 5-HT receptors. They're distributed in areas of the brain related to emotion and mood regulation. When they get hit by this massive surge, they mediate these relaxing, calming, anxiolytic effects.
So that's the peace.
That directly links to the profound, overwhelming feelings of peace and well-being that NDEs report. The sensation that everything is okay, even as they are physically dying.
And the other one?
Conversely, you have the 5-HT receptors. These are highly involved in perception and sensory processing. When these are activated, they mediate the perceptive and, well, the hallucinogenic features, the visual elements, the sense of acceleration, the intensity of the experience.
So the brain is simultaneously hitting the panic button and the full relaxation button, creating this paradoxical state of calm euphoria alongside vivid, strange perceptions. What's the working hypothesis for why evolution would even design a mechanism like this?
The evolutionary hypothesis suggests that this massive coordinated release, it's often called an endogenous release cascade, could actually serve a crucial neuroprotective function.
Protecting the brain from damage.
It could be a final, desperate mechanism to buffer the brain tissue against the acute damage from the anoxia. Essentially, shutting down non-essential functions while bathing critical areas in soothing and excitatory chemicals to manage the trauma. A last-ditch effort to save the hardware.
Okay, so beyond serotonin, you mentioned a whole chemical cocktail. Let's talk about the calming side of that cocktail, the GABAergic system.
Right, GABA, or gamma-O-butyric acid. It's the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. Its job is to quiet the whole system down.
The brakes.
Exactly, the brakes. And the key physiological insight here is that while GABA is always being synthesized, its degradation, the process of breaking it down and clearing it away, is highly dependent on oxygen.
Ah, okay. So when oxygen levels plummet during clinical death.
Precisely. Under hypoxic or low oxygen conditions, GABA degradation slows way down, which means GABA levels in the brain rise, and they rise substantially.
And what are the consequences of that?
The behavioral consequences mirror the NDE experience perfectly. It induces a deep, calming relaxation, powerful anti-anxiety effects, and eventually the loss of consciousness. It's very similar to what happens when you administer powerful sedatives like benzodiazepines or barbiturates. The dying brain is, in effect, auto-administering a high-dose tranquilizer.
That accounts for the deep peace and the loss of connection to the body. But NDEs are also described as being hyper-real, a feeling that the experience is more real than life. Where does that intensity come from?
That intense sense of hyperreality that likely involves the glutamatergic system. It uses glutamate, which is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain.
The accelerator.
Right. And while the interactions are incredibly complex, the overall effect is that this system provides the neurobiological framework for those profound feelings of existential awe, clarity, and that transformative sense of realness that so many NDEs report.
And it's all interconnected.
It is. The activation of the serotonergic pathways can indirectly affect dopamine release, which is critical for reward, motivation, and the intensity of an experience. So you see how the chemical cascade provides the light, the calm, and the intense clarity all at the same time.
This sounds almost identical to the effects of powerful psychedelic compounds. I'm thinking particularly of DMT, which also interacts heavily with those 5-HT2 receptors. How close is that link, really?
Phenomenologically, the overlap is very strong. In fact, the only placebo-controlled study to formally and prospectively explore DMT as an NDE model found substantial similarities between the subjective effects of the drug and the core NDE reports.
And that led to a pretty controversial hypothesis.
It did. The controversial but very intriguing hypothesis that endogenous DMT that's produced naturally within the body might be released from areas like the pineal gland during the dying process, acting as the trigger for the NDE.
But if the chemistry is so similar, why aren't induced psychedelic experiences generally considered identical to spontaneous NDEs? What's the clinical differentiator?
I think the differentiator is the profound and lasting transformation. That goes way beyond the immediate subjective perception. While NDE-like experiences can be induced by compounds like ketamine, LSD, or psilocybin,
They don't stick in the same way.
they don't. Spontaneous NDEs are overwhelmingly reported as transformational. They result in deep, irreversible changes in a person's attitudes, their values, and very often a complete absence of the fear of death. Induced experiences, while intense, rarely lead to that level of enduring, positive, fundamental life restructuring that is the absolute hallmark of the spontaneous NDE.
So the chemical mechanism might explain the visuals and the feelings, but it doesn't seem to adequately explain the lasting existential impact.
That's a key weakness, and it's something we'll definitely revisit when we get to the non-local hypothesis.
Okay, so let's move from general neurochemistry to specific brain regions. The materialist model finds some really strong support by localizing key NDE features, especially that feeling of leaving the body, to very small specific parts of the brain.
Yes, and here we're talking about the temporoparietal junction, or the TPJ.
And that area is crucial for our sense of where our body is in space, right?
Exactly. The TPJ acts as a hub. It integrates all the sensory information to help us maintain a stable sense of self and body localization. And some pioneering studies have shown that if you electrically stimulate the TPJs in conscious patients, you can trigger specific NDE-like phenomena.
So what happens when you stimulate the right side?
Stimulation of the right TPJ specifically elicits disembodiment. Patients will suddenly report feeling detached from their physical body, maybe hovering above it, or feeling their limbs distort. These are classic sensations that perfectly mimic the onset of an out-of-body experience.
Wow. And what about the encounters with entities or deceased relatives? That feels like a much more complex phenomenon than just feeling disconnected from your body.
Well, that has been linked to the left TPJ. Electrical stimulation on that side can trigger an illusion of experiencing the presence of another person in your immediate space. It's sometimes called an own-body illusion, where the brain misattributes a sense of self-awareness to a location outside the physical body.
So a sort of shadow person.
A felt presence, yes. And this is seen as a potential localized explanation for those classic encounters with spiritual entities or figures that are reported during an NDE.
This seems really compelling. I mean, if we can trigger OBEs and the sense of a presence just by zapping a specific spot in the brain, why isn't that considered definitive proof? Why isn't that case closed, that NDEs are just localized brain misfirings?
It's a great question, but that localization model faces a crucial critique. It's just too isolated to explain the full complexity of the NDE. Electrical stimulation is highly localized, it's very discrete. A real NDE is happening in the context of bulk neurotransmission.
Right, that chemical bomb we talked about.
Exactly. That massive, simultaneous, chaotic release of serotonin, dopamine, GABA, glutamate, all happening across the entire brain at once. The complexity of the real-time physiological crisis is likely far, far greater than what localized electrical stimulation can possibly reproduce in isolation. The brain isn't just misfiring in one spot, it's drowning in a neurochemical cascade while simultaneously starving for oxygen.
Let's circle back to the ketamine case study, because that really brings together the neurochemical cascade and the physiological crisis in one single, well-documented event.
Yes, the case of the 73-year-old woman is a powerful piece of evidence that supports the materialist mechanism. She suffered acute respiratory failure, which led to profound hypoxia, low oxygen, and hypercapnia, which is high carbon dioxide.
And during this crisis, she was given ketamine.
A massive dose of it, yes.
Yeah.
500 milligrams, which is about 7 milligen a kilogram for an emergency intubation.
So a huge dose delivered right at the peak of physiological stress. What was the NDE she reported?
It was vivid and clinically verifiable. It scored a 34 out of 80 on the NDEC scale. It had all the classic features: intense peacefulness, the bright light encounters with entities. But the key is analyzing the mechanism. Ketamine is what's known as an NMDA antagonist.
Okay, can you explain that mechanism for our listener?
Sure. NMDA receptors are crucial for brain communication. By blocking them, ketamine basically throws off the brain's delicate balance of excitation and inhibition. Specifically, it reduces the release of GABA from the inhibitory interneurons,
The brakes.
which leads to a massive increase in activity in the excitatory pyramidal neurons, the accelerator. And this pharmacological cascade is known to induce the exact symptoms reported in NDEs: perceptual changes, OBEs, intense feelings of awe, positivity, and interconnectedness.
So this single case gives us a really clear blueprint. We have profound physiological stress, a hypoxia and hypercapnia. You combine that with a specific pharmacological agent, the NMDA antagonism, and you get the NDE phenomenology.
It strongly supports the idea that the NDE was driven by that cocktail of chemicals and the physiological state, regardless of the patient's own cognitive predisposition or beliefs. It provides a clear mechanism by which a material brain under extreme duress can generate an intensely complex and real-feeling conscious experience.
Okay, now we have to get to the most rigorous, recent clinical data point, and this is one that truly stretches the limits of that materialist explanation. The AWARE-2 study. This study directly monitored brain activity during cardiac arrest.
The AWARE-2 study, led by Sam Parnia and published in 2023, was an absolute landmark. It was a prospective, multi-site investigation. They monitored patients during CPR at 25 different hospitals, and they were specifically looking for electrocortical biomarkers like ED and also cerebral oxygenation levels.
And what were the overall findings regarding awareness?
The findings were revolutionary. While the majority of patients, of course, didn't recall anything, 11 of the 28 survivors they interviewed reported clear memories or perceptions that were suggestive of consciousness. These ranged from intense dreamlike states to full, transcendent recalled experiences of death, or RADs.
But the crucial part, the objective part, was the biomarker data.
Yes. And let's focus on that EEG data because this is where the old assumptions are just shattered. Despite marked cerebral ischemia, which means the brain was severely deprived of blood and oxygen, with the mean regional cerebral oxygen saturation, RSO2, averaging only 43%, they detected normal electroencephalogram patterns.
Normal EEG. Patterns consistent with what?
Consistent with lucid consciousness. Specifically, they saw delta, theta, and alpha brainwaves emerging as long as 35 to 60 minutes into CPR.
Wait a second. Let's make sure our listener understands the magnitude of that claim. Standard knowledge says consciousness needs high levels of oxygen and blood flow. What is the normal blood flow during CPR?
During CPR, with external heart massage, the cerebral blood supply is typically only 5 to 10% of its normal resting value. That pressure is clinically defined as insufficient for adequate oxygen and glucose delivery to support any kind of higher cognitive function.
And that 43% oxygen saturation number.
To put that in context, anything below 50% is considered severe ischemia and usually leads very rapidly to irreparable brain damage.
So even with the brain starved receiving just a tiny fraction of the necessary resources-structured, network-level cognitive activity, the kind we see in a waking person, was suddenly being detected 35 or even 60 minutes into the resuscitation process? That's just astonishing.
It is. The emergence of these normal EEG patterns is what the researchers are now proposing as a critical biomarker for lucidity and these recalled experiences of death. And remember the clinical reality here. Nobody regains consciousness from external heart massage alone. You need successful defibrillation to restore full circulation. This suggests there's this brief, paradoxical period where high-level cognitive processes can re-engage while the body is still, for all intents and purposes, dying.
And that just fundamentally challenges the idea that full brain function is a prerequisite for awareness.
It really does.
The AWARE-2 study pushes the materialist explanation to its absolute limit, suggesting consciousness can pop up where it really shouldn't. But the materialist models, even the sophisticated Neptune model, still struggle fundamentally with one key category of NDE data, veridical perceptions.
This is the domain of what we call Veridical Near-Death Experiences, or vNDEs. And this is where the neurophysiological explanation really truly breaks down.
So define veridical perceptions for us.
A veridical perception is a report where the experiencer describes accurate, verifiable details of events that were happening in the physical environment, but that they had absolutely no ordinary sensory access to.
Give us an example. We're not just talking about seeing their body on the operating table, but something that would be impossible for them to know.
Exactly. We're talking about observing conversations or actions happening in another room entirely. Seeing and later accurately describing an object that was placed in an inaccessible location, like a specific shoe or a surgical instrument on a high shelf near the ceiling. or reporting the accurate details and sequence of events unfolding outside of their physical location, details that are later confirmed by third parties.
Some of these reports are even of events happening outside the hospital, I've read.
That's right. There are cases of NDEs seeing and describing events that occurred miles away, which they later verified.
And have these cases been rigorously collected and documented? This isn't just folklore.
No, there are extensive systematic collections. A recent paper by Rivas and his colleagues, for example, synthesized over 120 verified cases of paranormal or veridical phenomena within NDEs. And these cases were confirmed not just by the patient, but by third parties, the doctors, the nurses, family members, who corroborated the specific, previously unknown details.
So if we have over 120 verified confirmed cases, why isn't this considered definitive proof of consciousness functioning non-locally? Where does the scientific skepticism focus its attack?
Well, the skepticism focuses on the methodological hurdles, primarily the issue of precise timing confirmation.
Right. How do you know when they saw it?
Exactly. Skeptics correctly point out that while the patient was clinically dead for, say, 5 minutes, we can't always definitively prove that the accurate perception occurred precisely during the period of flatline brain activity rather than, say, during the rapid onset of the crisis or a fleeting moment of consciousness after resuscitation began.
There are also issues with documentation, I imagine.
Yes. We struggle with rigorous, standardized documentation protocols that can rule out subtle sensory input or inferential reasoning or even just pure luck.
That timing challenge is huge. If you can't nail down the time frame, the evidence remains circumstantial. But the research community is trying to fix the documentation problem, aren't they? They've created a new, standardized assessment tool specifically for veridicality.
They have. They developed the vNDE scale, the Veridical Near-Death Experience Scale. It was created using the rigorous Delphi method, which is a consensus-driven process involving multiple experts to define what constitutes robust evidence. It consists of 8 items, and the scoring transforms the findings into 4 structured levels of evidential strength: very low, low, moderate, and strong.
And how did it do when they tested it? Did the experts actually agree on which cases were strong evidence?
The initial inter-rater validation, which used both human experts and specialized AI raters, was actually very promising. While getting everyone to agree on a single level of strength was difficult, one person might say moderate, another strong, when they combined adjacent levels like moderate plus strong, the agreement rate shot up to over 82%.
So they generally agree on the overall quality of the evidence.
Yes, when the description is detailed enough, it suggests the scale can successfully separate the wheat from the chaff.
And what are the clinical gatekeepers built into this scale? What makes a case non-valid?
It enforces 2 critical control steps to maintain scientific rigor. First, the criterion for third-person verification has to be met. If you can't independently confirm the accuracy of the perception, for example, the doctor confirms the specific instrument was on that high shelf, you have to stop the scale application immediately.
Third-party verification is the essential gatekeeper.
It is. And second, if the patient only reports erroneous perceptions with no verified elements, the case is filtered out. The tool is really designed to separate true non-local perception from common delirium or misinterpretation.
And these verified perception data points, they are the absolute bedrock of the most radical explanation, the non-local consciousness model.
Right. This model posits that consciousness is fundamental, it's universally present, and it's not limited to or produced by the brain. Researchers like Van Lommel argue that NDEs demonstrate an enhanced consciousness and a totally unaltered self-identity that's experienced separately from the physical body. And that just directly challenges the idea that consciousness is merely an emergent property of a localized brain.
So in this model, the brain's role shifts entirely. It goes from being the producer of consciousness to being more of a translator, an interface.
Precisely. The brain is often likened to a transceiver, a combination transmitter and receiver. It receives wave fields of information which constitute consciousness that are always present in the field of reality.
What's a good analogy for that?
Think of a television set. The TV receives electromagnetic waves that carry images and sound, but it doesn't generate the programming itself. Or think of your computer receiving the internet. Billions of websites are encoded in waves, and the computer merely provides the interface to access them. During the dying process, the brain, perhaps because of that flood of neurochemicals, might be temporarily detuning from the body, allowing access to this broader, non-local field of consciousness.
One of the arguments supporting this idea revolves around brain storage capacity. Is it even possible for the brain to physically store every single memory and sensory experience of an entire lifetime?
That's a key philosophical argument used against localization. Researchers suggest that the brain may simply not have enough capacity to store the information from all life experiences, especially when you consider the incredibly detailed, panoramic, and instantaneous nature of the life reviews reported during NDEs.
So if the brain is a receiver,
Then that vast amount of data could be stored non-locally, like a cloud server, with the brain merely accessing it when needed.
and finally, there are the extreme anatomical cases that dramatically challenge the idea that consciousness is localized in the physical brain structure itself.
The famous case of the young man with severe hydrocephalus is often cited here. This was a man who had a degree in mathematics, lived a completely normal life, and had an IQ of 126. But a brain scan revealed that 95% of his skull was filled with cerebrospinal fluid.
Wait, 95% fluid, but he had a math degree and a high IQ. How is that even possible if high-level cognitive function requires intact, specific brain regions?
It left him with barely 100 grams of functional brain tissue compared to the normal 1,500 grams. It's highly anomalous, and it forces us to question localization. If consciousness and high intelligence can persist and function normally with such a drastically reduced brain structure, it serves as a powerful argument that conscious function isn't confined to the physical volume of the brain tissue.
Of course, the materialist counterargument would be neuroplasticity, that the small amount of remaining tissue somehow compensated, becoming hyper-efficient.
And the non-local model acknowledges neuroplasticity, but argues that a case like this goes way beyond mere compensation. If the brain were purely the generator, such a massive reduction in volume should lead to a corresponding radical deficit in intellectual function, especially a skill like mathematics, which we think is fairly localized. The fact that he remained entirely unimpaired supports the idea that the brain is facilitating or receiving consciousness rather than generating it from scratch.
Okay, this is where the distinction between a simple drug-induced hallucination and a spontaneous NDE becomes crystal clear. It's the core experiential element of the holographic life review. What happens when an individual goes through this?
This is arguably the most transformative aspect of the entire NDE. The experiencer undergoes this panoramic, instantaneous, holographic playback of their whole life, and they don't just passively watch it like a movie. They subjectively and instantaneously relive every single act, word, and thought they ever had.
And the crucial element, the part that seems to contain a moral instruction, is that sense of interconnectedness. They actually feel the impact of their actions on other people.
Yes, the term that's often used is entanglement. They are forced to connect with the emotions and the consequences of their actions on others. So if they were unkind to a parent or dismissive of a colleague, they don't just recall the act, they instantly feel the resulting sorrow or the pain or the joy as if it were their own. The whole experience is delivered not as some divine judgment, but as perfect, unvarnished self-knowledge and empathy.
It's like an enforced universal lesson in empathy and consequence. And what's the distillation? What are the ultimate core teachings that are revealed during this review?
The message is astonishingly consistent across thousands and thousands of accounts. The fundamental teachings always distill down to just two virtues. Love and knowledge are paramount. The emphasis is always placed on unconditional love, on compassion, on self-reflection, and on the relentless pursuit of knowledge. They come to realize that this quest for understanding continues, unbound by physical death.
And the physics of time perception during this instantaneous review is just mind-boggling.
It speaks volumes about the non-local nature of that state. The subjective experience is that they relive decades of memories, every minute detail, in what felt like a fraction of a second. Often this corresponds to the few minutes the resuscitation team was actively working on them. It suggests that our normal constraints of time and space are just fundamentally non-existent in this state of consciousness.
After experiencing this state of limitlessness and unconditional love and perfect knowledge, the return to the physical body must be horrifying.
It is consistently described as being deeply traumatic. The conscious return into the physical body is often called oppressive, awful, or even violent. They feel suddenly locked up in a small, damaged, limited body, forced to endure the pain, the disease, the material restrictions of physical reality after tasting this unconditional limitlessness. That shock is often the start of a very long-term struggle.
And that profound experience leads to equally profound long-term transformation. This is supported by longitudinal studies that track these individuals for years afterward. What are the key lasting changes?
The transformations are incredibly consistent and they're comprehensive, affecting every area of a person's life. First, there's the absolute loss of the fear of death. They have experienced the continuity of consciousness and they know on a deep level that death is merely a transition.
A change in values, too.
A massive, instantaneous shift in life, insight, and values. Their focus shifts dramatically away from superficial pursuits, material possessions, social power, status, and moves toward unconditional love, service, and empathy. And that's directed first toward themselves and then outward toward others and to nature.
And they often report enhanced intuition.
Yes, very frequently. An enhanced intuitive sensibility, which is a type of non-local perception. This can manifest as clairvoyance, precognition, or just a persistent, acute ability to sense what others are feeling or thinking, which can make them hyper-aware of their social environment.
That level of heightened sensitivity and completely changed priorities must make re-entry into a normal materialist society incredibly difficult. It sounds almost like a spiritual trauma.
It often is. The magnitude of that internal change frequently leads to social isolation, a deep spiritual crisis, sometimes depression. They feel homesick for the profound bliss they experienced, and they struggle to communicate what happened to them.
And the source material mentions a strikingly high rate of divorce among NDE experiencers. That really illustrates the profound social cost.
It's a heartbreaking statistic. Some studies indicate a divorce rate of more than 50% in certain cohorts. It happens because the partner who did not have the experience feels like they are suddenly married to an entirely different person.
Because the old goals don't matter anymore.
Exactly. The NDE is no longer interested in the mutual goals of accumulating wealth or seeking status or engaging in competitive behavior, and that leads to these fundamental value conflicts that their relationship just can't bridge.
But let's bring this back to the material world for a moment. The fact that consciousness changes so dramatically, leading to these profound behavioral changes, that means this non-local experience actually alters the physical reality of the brain through neuroplasticity.
This is the critical connection point that, in a way, unites the two frameworks. The long-term psychological transformation that results from the NDE, that permanent shift in behavior and values, it suggests that a conscious experience can fundamentally change the physical function and structure of the brain itself. This is often described as non-local perturbation, where the mind is influencing matter.
What are some of the most reliable known examples of consciousness-changing brain structure?
We see this so clearly in long-term cognitive practices. For example, individuals who engage in sustained meditation show permanently altered brain activity. Specifically, they manifest higher levels of sustained gamma waves, reflecting structural changes that they've cultivated over years.
And the classic example of the London taxi drivers.
Right. After they undergo the intense training to memorize the comprehensive map of London, a test called the knowledge, the volume of their posterior hippocampi, the region of the brain associated with spatial memory, physically enlarges. The mind, through conscious effort and experience, directly reshapes the physical brain.
The knowledge that we're gleaning from NDE research and this idea of the persistence of consciousness, it forces us to look very closely at our most fundamental medical definition, the moment of death itself.
Yes, and this centers on a critical and often semantic debate over whether death should be defined as merely permanent versus irreversible.
That's the distinction.
Permanent means the state will not be reversed, even if some biological capacity remains. Irreversible means the state cannot be reversed because of total, non-recoverable cellular decay. The argument in this field is that biological death must be defined as the irreversible loss of circulation and functional capacity.
And modern medical advances are really challenging that traditional definition.
They are. Advanced resuscitation and critical care technology pose a huge clinical challenge. We are now capable of restoring cellular and metabolic activity through techniques like ECMO, which is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. We can effectively prevent the permanence of death for longer and longer periods. But this metabolic viability does not guarantee the recovery of higher brain functions, like conscious awareness, which is essential for the person to return as the self they were.
So we can keep the body metabolically alive, but the functional human being, the conscious self, may be irreversibly gone.
Precisely. This emphasizes the distinction between sustaining metabolic life and achieving functional recovery. The NDE findings really compel us to define death by the irreversible loss of global brain function and conscious awareness, rather than simply the cessation of circulation, especially if metabolic activity can be artificially or temporarily restored.
What are the ultimate implications of all this knowledge, the neurochemical insights and the non-local evidence, for healthcare practitioners who are dealing with end-of-life care?
The knowledge that consciousness and cognitive activity may persist during and immediately after clinical death has enormous practical significance. These findings must inform our approach to so many medical and ethical problems. We have to reconsider the care we give to comatose or dying patients, assuming that some degree of awareness might be present, even if it's undetectable by our current bedside monitors.
And this extends quite dramatically to core ethical issues like organ removal.
Oh, yes. The possibility of continued consciousness and a persistent self-identity at the moment of physical death fundamentally changes the ethical calculation around sensitive procedures like euthanasia, and particularly the timing and criteria for the removal of organs from patients who are classified as brain dead, but who often still have a beating heart and a warm, metabolically active body.
So if there's even a chance of non-local continuity of consciousness,
Then our medical protocols must adapt to recognize the patient's subjective reality.
it seems like this whole body of research is demanding that medicine moves toward a model where compassion, informed by the subjective reality of the patient, is interwoven with technical advancement.
Absolutely. The future of healthcare really depends not just on technical and medical advances, but on compassion for individual patients and their families. It requires us to accommodate these extraordinary conscious experiences rather than immediately dismissing them as just physiological artifacts.
We have thoroughly traversed this incredibly complex landscape. We started by defining the paradox,
Yeah.
rich consciousness during brain failure.
And we found that the Neptune model provides some very compelling, localized, materialist mechanisms for the perception-related features. The light, the peace, the tunnel. It can all be plausibly explained by the chaotic surge of serotonin, GABA, and glutamate, and the localized activity of the TPJ.
But those explanations, however detailed they are, ultimately fall short when they're confronted with the robustness of the veridical perceptions, the complexity of that instantaneous holographic life review, and the total irreversible transformation of the NDEs value system.
All of which strongly support the idea of consciousness existing non-locally and independent of a compromised brain.
And what's truly fascinating is that this ultimate existential crisis yields a universal, profound moral lesson, that love and knowledge are the only enduring, worthwhile pursuits in existence.
It's an incredible message to come back with.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We have empirical evidence of both a neurochemical cascade in the dying brain and verified perceptions that seem entirely independent of that brain's function. We also know through neuroplasticity that consciousness can physically alter the brain structure throughout life.
And this raises a really important final question for you to explore. If consciousness is non-local, not limited by space and time during a crisis, and if your conscious experiences can physically reshape your brain, what does this ongoing research imply about the true nature of your conscious life right now, before the crisis even begins?
If the ultimate wisdom revealed at the boundary of life centers only on love and knowledge, perhaps that is where we should invest our conscious energy and focus today. A powerful and very relevant thought to leave you with. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.